Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar with Diligent on the topic of information security governance. We apologise for any technical issues you may have had in the run-up to today's webinar, but hopefully everybody who wanted to join has joined, and we hope you enjoyed today's session. My name is Holly Groom, and I'm joined today by my colleague Nathan Birtle, who's our VP Sales and Business Development here in EMEA, and we're also joined by our colleague Victor Shadare, who's a security engineer here in the London office at Diligent. Today we are going to talk to you about information security governance, best practices, and how to successfully implement a security program company-wide. So before we get started, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes. This webinar will last 30 minutes long. We will provide a recording of today's webinar and send that out to everyone that registered within 24 hours, and you can feel free to forward that along to any of your colleagues or board members or security experts who were unable to join us today. If you'd like to ask any questions during today's webinar, you can do so via the Ask a Question pane on the right-hand side of your screen. And finally, there's a couple of polls and surveys which we would very much appreciate if you could join in. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Nathan and Victor.
Thank you, Holly, and welcome everybody. By way of further introduction, I'm Nathan. My responsibility when it comes to security is having management level discussions with our clients and prospective clients, as well as taking a management role within Diligent on how we set up and manage our information security governance. Victor, as a senior in Diligent, but also how we enforce that to ensure we have the highest levels of security within our organization. And also another part of Victor's role is to talk to our clients and prospective clients about the security structures and processes that we enforce to allow them to benefit from the high levels of security as part of our service. Before we go into the topics for today, I thought it was worth just highlighting some of the findings from the government's cybersecurity breaches survey in 2016, and if you'd like a link to this survey and the results from it, we'd be happy to provide one. But a couple of things that were interesting, that when they surveyed organizations, 69% of businesses said cybersecurity is a high priority for senior managers. Now, with some of the impact of cybersecurity breaches today, I find that a worryingly low number, but even more worrying in many ways is the fact that only 29% of organizations surveyed had formal cybersecurity policies, and only 10% had formal incident management programs and procedures in place. If you consider that another aspect of this survey was 13% of organizations only set cybersecurity standards for their suppliers, I think there's a fairly big gap that exists at the moment between the threats from cybersecurity and breaches of that, and how organizations are setting up structures and awareness to manage that. And that's exactly what we're going to cover in the seminar today. So there are four main topics we're going to go through. We're going to look at what is information security governance, why it's important, who's responsible for that within organizations, and then we'll look at 5 best practices to guide successful implementation of information security governance. Before we go ahead though, it would be helpful for us if we could do a quick poll for people attending to indicate their level of security awareness and their profiles within an organization. So if you wouldn't mind, we'd be grateful if you could select one of the 3 items to indicate your role within an organization, either as a security professional, involved in governance with some knowledge of security, or no direct security responsibility yourself. So we'll pause for a moment while we look at the people take time to vote, and before we look at the results of the poll. And the results that we can see are that the vast majority of people attending the webinar today are involved in governance with some level of security, some security professionals, and 7% with no direct security responsibility. So as we go through the remaining parts of this session, we'll tailor the level of technical detail that Victor will be providing rather than myself in line with that response. So thank you for that aspect. So the first thing we're going to look at is what is information security governance itself, and there are many definitions that you can find on from different organizations and different websites around this. The one that you see there in quotes is from the Governance Institute, essentially saying it's a set of responsibilities and practices exercised by board and management with the goal of providing strategic direction to ensure that objectives are achieved, risks are managed, and that the organization's resources are used responsibly. And you see three different aspects of that: the structure of an organization, roles and responsibilities, and the defined measurements of tasks. So Victor, in practice, what does this mean for an organization?
Well, as you've pointed out, there are those essential three elements to good security governance. Organizational structure is a key to this, and that is because each organization needs to understand who is responsible for what. The structure must begin with the highest level of governance within the organization. So the executive management, the board, etc. They are ultimately responsible for information security and information security governance within the organization. Added to that, assigning roles and responsibilities. As I've just mentioned, the executive management, that is your senior management, whatever your structure is in your organization, has the ultimate responsibility. However, as we all know, information security and keeping that security is a responsibility of everyone within the organization. But in order for governance to work effectively, we do need to assign relevant roles and responsibilities so that everyone within the organization knows whom to approach and who is responsible for providing the key elements of information governance. Added to that, then, we need to define the tasks and also measure those tasks. So with those three in place, we can then effectively begin to manage and maintain our information security governance structure.
Thanks. And so how does that relate to a standard such as ISO 27001? Often when we talk to organizations who are either using diligent service or considering that, this is an important aspect of how they evaluate people to work with. And when you look at that survey from the data breach that said only 13% of businesses set cybersecurity standards for their suppliers, of those 13%, I expect a lot of people look for ISO 27001 certification. Would that be fair?
Absolutely, and that's a great point. I would say that for good information security governance, what actually underpins it is the requirements of the ISO 27001 certification. For those who are familiar with the certification, a brief review shows that Clause 5.1 requires an organization's leadership to be committed to security. They are the ones who will shape what security is within the organization, and they will set the strategy for the organization's security requirements. And then again, Clause 5.2 requires roles and responsibilities to be defined. So straight away we can see that for good information security governance, the two of the key elements that we defined previously, organizational structure and assignment of roles and responsibilities, are key to achieving and maintaining ISO 27001 certification. So I would say that it is an essential part of achieving, maintaining, and continuing to abide by that certification, that you have a good governance structure in place. And also your good governance structure goes a long way to ensuring that your information security requirements are met.
Thank you. So that's a little introduction as to what information security governance is, how it might relate to standards that people have heard of. So why is it so important? Well, on the chart here we look at some aspects of how business is changing, how organizations are changing in terms of data becoming more accessible to employees via different mobile devices, use of services such as cloud or hosted services provided by many organizations, and becoming increasingly used within commerce and industry today. I suppose the way I think of this is some examples and maybe some high-profile cases of where information security governance has not worked out well. One of the more recent high-profile cases, I suppose, was the Colin Powell example in the US, where, for those of you not familiar, there was a data breach at Colin Powell's personal email, which I believe was a Gmail service that was being used. In fact, it's always surprising to me how many board members and executives are still using personal email for this sort of communication. I think we did a survey recently, and another study was about 30%. But in this case, the Gmail was hacked, and some of the information gathered as a response of that was related to his role as a director on the board of Salesforce.com, and it included aspects of acquisition targets for Salesforce. And people may remember this in the headlines because the headlines at the time related to this breach were due to the fact that Twitter as an organization was not on that acquisition list, and that made people consider and take a view on the value of Twitter as an organization as a result. So I'm assuming, Victor, that for those sorts of organizations and for people at that sort of level of responsibility, there is some sort of information security governance being applied, but how do you make sure you enforce these things more effectively?
Well, Nathan, I would say that a key component of good information security governance is controlling the flow of your data. In the scenario that you just mentioned, that is Colin Powell, it's quite clear that the data that belonged to the organization wasn't being controlled in an adequate manner. Having the right policies and procedures in place, ensuring your people know them and comply to them is great. But you must also have the right technology to marshal and enforce those policies. Again, going back to Colin Powell, you can see that the policies presumably were in place, but the technology to marshal that and to enforce that perhaps wasn't. And that's why he was able to send confidential company information to an outsourced free email service such as Gmail. Within Diligence, we ensure, and we're able to ensure that our customers benefit from this, that the flow of your data is controlled. With our products, Diligent Boards, you can actually set within the structure who has access to what information, what they can do with that information. So all of your data is controlled by your internal administrators. They can set policies that allow individuals to either print, download, email, review offline content, etc. And that can be set for each individual within the organization. So where one individual has a set of restrictions, another may not, and that's all dependent on how you, the user, wants to set that up. With that, you're able to control your flow of data, and then issues such as the one with Colin Powell are very, very unlikely.
So it's the case of not only setting the policies but having the right technology in place to enforce them, because you then protect people from themselves in that way. Would that be a fair summary?
Absolutely. As I said, policies, procedures, all well and good, must have them in place, people must follow them. Technology and the services behind them to enforce that and ensure compliance with it is a must.
Okay, thank you. So what do we look at who is responsible for information security? Now, I know as part of our regular ISO 27001 audits, it's certainly true that everyone should be concerned and consider security a responsibility within the organization. Can you expand on that a little bit for us?
Yes, we all know. Well, yes, we all know that having a good security awareness program within an organization is essential to information security and information security governance. However, it's not so clear in some organizations that this has been performed, or it's been adhered to, or it's been followed. In our organization, for instance, we ensure that all of our new starters receive an email on the day they join, and that email has a link to the Information Security Awareness Program, which they must use within the week that they start. If they don't, then they receive an email and a prompt, and the security group, the IT group, also receives an email informing us that that hasn't been done. We then forward that on to our HR team, who will follow up. Also, we ensure that our users have annual awareness and refresher courses coupled with a test. In doing this, we're able to at least ensure that our users are aware of information security, adhere to the policies and procedures that are bounded in our information security commitment, and that we're able to track and monitor that they are actually attending the course, taking the test, and passing it.
So that's helpful for every person in the organization and their level of awareness and training around these sorts of issues. What about leadership from the top? where and how important is cybersecurity on boards' agendas, and how are the best practice boards addressing the issue and understanding the issues around cybersecurity?
Well, as I said, everyone in our organization, right from the chief executive all the way down to our new interns, have to take the information security awareness course. Added to that, we have a risk management committee that meets on a monthly basis. This committee meets to assess the organization's cyber readiness, i.e. our cyber posture. We meet and ensure that all of the threats, risks, etc. that are out there in the wild are identified, and that we have a program in place to manage those and to mitigate any relevant security issues to us. In doing this, we're able to ensure that our senior security team, as well as our executive management team, are working together to enforce our policies, procedures, and to enforce security within the organization.
And it's these sort of security committees or technology committees that also report into the board and give board advice on cybersecurity issues that they need to consider. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely, yes. The chair of the risk management committee is the CTO, who's an executive vice president. Also, we have senior members of staff such as Nathan here, who is the senior vice president for EMEA, who attend these meetings and also help to govern and structure our risk management commitment. This is all part of our information security compliance that we use for ISO 27001, as well as our information security governance, which the whole organization uses.
Yeah, and I think this really does help bridge the gap between board members who recognize that cybersecurity is an issue, but don't feel they are well enough informed or aware of the aspects, specific aspects of these, and so rely on technology subcommittees of this sort to provide that sort of guidance and allow the board to really lead with cybersecurity, because it's essential, bearing in mind the overall risks and exposures that can come from that going wrong. Let's talk about some best practices, though, since that's the second part of our webinar today. What we're going to look at are 5 different best practices around the implementation of information security governance. One is looking at the holistic approach. The second is how we raise awareness and training through the organization. We covered a little bit of that already. Monitoring and measurement of risk and security aspects of the system. How we foster open communication, and how we promote agility and adaptability in this ever-changing environment. And we'll look at each of those in turn. So firstly, if we take the holistic approach, how we look at this from an overall perspective. On the chart there you see some key questions that need to be asked when you consider the overall information security governance arena. So one is around data and how it's protected, one is around risks, strategic policies, local regulations, etc. Now, we've already talked a little bit so far about policies and procedures and how they're set up. Well, why don't we dig into one of these in a little bit more detail, Victor? What about data? Yeah, well, can you just give some practical examples of what an organization might consider when it comes to looking at its data, classifying it, and the sort of level of protection you provide?
Well, yes, data, the key element in any organization's business. At Diligent, we take a holistic approach at data, and working with our stakeholders, we identify A, the data owners, and B, the data locations. In doing this, we're able to then tailor our cybersecurity program to protecting that data. So we look at where the data resides and where it's transmitted from and transmitted to. We encrypt all of our data on our servers. So, for instance, one of our customers, when they upload their data into our servers, we ensure that that data is protected by encrypting it on our SQL servers, on our databases. But of course, before we do any of this, we need to identify the data and classify the data. We have taken the approach that all of our customer data must be classified as customer confidential, and that is our highest level of labeling for data. So in effect, what that means is that regardless of who the customer is, regardless of what data they upload into our servers, we ensure that we save that data we store that data encrypted to the highest level. At the moment, we use AES 256 for those of you who are of a technical bent, and we ensure that in storing that data, we are providing our customers with the confidence that their data is secure once it's with us and once it's been transmitted back to them. So in essence, then we label our data by identifying where it's processed from and identifying where it's transmitted to and from, and securing that data to the best practices available currently.
Thank you. So there have been some other high-profile breaches where organizations have struggled to answer a question quickly as to whether data that had been breached was encrypted or not. So what you're saying is if you have a good information security governance policy in place and the enforcement around that, the data aspect of that policy and the way you enforce it, you should know immediately what data is where and how that's stored in an encrypted way or not, and what encryption is used.
Absolutely, Nathan. Yes, it is surprising to me that recent breaches of data in some really high-profile, large organizations, these organizations have claimed that they were unable to identify which of their data sources had been taken and which of their data sources had been compromised. I find that really, really interesting because at Diligent, as I said, we are able to quickly identify data because we have labeled the data, we know which customer's data resides where, and we know that we're encrypting that data. We monitor the movement of that data in its encrypted form, so we can't actually see the data, but we know where it's going and where it's coming from. And in so doing, we're able to track the flow of that data and identify any issues before those issues actually become a major talking point.
Thank you. So let's look at the second approach, and this is one that we've covered already to a large degree in some of the earlier conversations. So I don't think we need to expand on it further other than to say it's creating awareness and training throughout the organization is a key part of any information security governance practice. The ISO 27001 certification that we adhere to and we are audited on within Diligent is one way that we use to as a basis for the annual training and awareness sessions that we provide for our employees and the testing that goes along with that. So that's just an example of how we can do it. I don't think we'll spend further time on this one right now to go into more details, but I think it's obviously an essential point that everyone is aware of their obligations and are trained to the right level to be able to enforce those obligations as well. If we look at the third best practice area that we were going to discuss today, and that's all around how we monitor and measure the system that's in place. Now, again, there are several aspects of that. You know, which policies are working, which are not, what individuals are in place, etc. One of those that I'd like to talk about, though, when it comes to monitoring, and often something that comes up in discussion with clients and prospective clients around the Diligent solution, is the use of things such as penetration tests. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Victor, and how they play a part in the monitoring and measurement of the governance solution?
Absolutely, Nathan, yes. I suppose that a number of our attendees will wonder what monitoring and measurement has to do with penetration testing. But essentially, we believe that in order to effectively measure how we're doing security-wise, we need to have a constant penetration test platform. So what we do is we have a rolling penetration test program where all of our products, the infrastructure behind those products and the applications are tested by an outside source and also by our internal sources. We then review the program, we review the reports from the pen test, and we are able to identify any areas for improvement. So therefore, we're able to measure how we're doing on a month-to-month basis, security-wise, and improve upon that. So I would say that it is quite essential as part of good governance to monitor and measure and constantly improve on information security within your organization.
Okay, thank you. And I guess that's always the desire of people that the threats are always changing in this sort of environment, and so those sorts of testing and learning from that makes a big difference when it comes to upholding the highest levels of security within an organization or for the sort of service that we provide. The fourth area that we're going to talk about with information security governance was a best practice around open communication between all stakeholders. Just give one quick example of how we might achieve that within Diligent.
Right. As earlier said, after the awareness program, part of what we do is ensure that all of our users know who has responsibility and who has whose role it is to for information flow. So what we do at Diligent is we publish roles and responsibilities for the entire organization, and in so doing, where any of our users encounter an issue, an information security issue, they know exactly who to approach, where to send their information to. For instance, we recently had one of our managers who received an email that appeared to come from our chief executive asking her to do something. Because of our open communications that we have fostered, the person in question was able to call the CEO directly and ask him if he had sent the email, because she was quite suspicious. And because of the effectiveness of our information security awareness program, she had known exactly how to identify the true source of the email. And of course, she had remembered what to do. She called the CEO, who then told her he hadn't sent the email, and it was all because of our open communications that we had fostered, that she felt comfortable with talking to the CEO. She could have called anyone else and had the same level of comfort. So open communications and fostering that is an essential part of good information security governance.
Okay, thank you. And then the fifth aspect of best practice we're considering is agility and adaptability. I suppose things change so quickly in this sort of environment. It's important to look at what's working, what's not working, how can we change to best effect. I think one of the interesting developments that we've implemented within Diligent recently for our clients is this aspect of code obfuscation, which is a way of ensuring that the apps that people use to access this data are even more secure than before. Maybe you just describe that briefly, Victor, because I think it's an interesting example of how we're always trying to look at potential exposures and addressing them before they become an issue.
Absolutely. In brief, ensuring that your organization is agile and adaptable is essential for good information security governance. Talking of the code obfuscation, what we identified was that a number of our customers were using our applications and asking what levels of security we had. They would pen test it and we would pen test it, and they were quite comfortable with it. However, our security team, as part of our good governance, constantly review what our development team is doing. And one of the things that we identified within security was that there are a number of actors out there in the wild who make it their goal in life to try and break applications, break into applications, regardless of where those applications come from. So we determined that having code obfuscation would enable us to apply another level of security to our apps. And what we found during our research was that a number of very high-profile organizations, including some major banks, didn't perform this. And because of that, their apps didn't have what we considered to be the highest level of security. So we're quite pleased that we were able to identify this as another source of security, and we were only able to do that because of our agility and adaptability.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's not something I'd heard people asking for ahead of us implementing this as a security measure. I think in any security infrastructure, people will always try to attack the weakest point. The Code in PAL example, they attacked the Gmail service because that was seen to be the weakest point of entry. And I think more people are looking at reverse engineering apps as a weak point of entry into organizations' infrastructure, which is why the code obfuscation is an interesting example of showing agility and always constantly looking to improve. Okay, so those are some of the 5 best practices. If we look at the next chart, it's always a work in progress. There's continuous improvement, revision and adapting always required in this sort of environment. We won't labour the point right now because we're running close to the end of the time for the webinar, but one of the things that I think is interesting to people is relating back to the first example we gave around Colin Powell, and as organisations want to extend the security to beyond just board level communication around board packs themselves, but to all board or executive leadership team communication, we're looking as to how we can support that improvement of security, and part of the changes that we made within Diligent is to introduce a service called Messenger, which essentially is a text email type communication where the security of that is exactly the same level as the board solution. So you have all the levels of encryption, etc., that Victor described previously, but also it extends that beyond the monthly or quarterly board and executive management meetings to all communication within those organisations, and save you using other free services where the control of how long that information is stored, where it gets distributed, is sort of beyond your control. So that's an example of another aspect of work in progress and how we go about improving. If we look at the next chart, one of the areas we're talking about is how technology can help, which Messenger was one part, and the boards app itself, which we described before, as another. And Diligent itself as an organisation, for those of you who are not familiar with the company, is been in business of over 15 years now in providing secure collaboration and communication services for executive and leadership teams. And we're very fortunate in so much as we have nearly 5,000 clients who work with us and over 140,000 users, be they board members, executives, administrators of the system. We have data centers globally. Our European clients use the data centers in Germany, where we have both our primary and backup service. And we're delighted to say that we offer an annual service for people to work with us. And annually, 99% of our clients choose to continue working with Diligent year on year. And we're told that's because they appreciate the usability, the robustness of the system, and the excellence of our customer support. I won't say any more about Diligent, but obviously we'd be very happy to describe any aspect of the company or the service that we provide in more detail, should you wish. Now, I think we're coming to the end of our time. So, Holly, please let me know if there's any specific questions that have been asked that you'd like us to answer at the moment.
Thank you, Nathan. We do have a few more questions, but we are running out of time, so we will make sure we come back to each and every one of you with an appropriate answer. Thank you very much for joining today, and have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.